Hello, this is Nicole Johnson-Starr with the PTSD Retreat Radio Talk Show. I am sitting here today with Dr. Rona Fields, a noted author of more than, what is 8 books. We got 8 books. She has traveled the world extensively. She knows about PTSD from many years of experience. She's been in the field longer than I've been around, and we won't even go there, but we'll just say she definitely knows her stuff, especially when it comes to PTSD from an international perspective. She's not just been studying in the United States. She has traveled the world, and one of the things she's actually, as you have a book coming out in February, Against Violence Against Women, that actually does touch on the trauma associated with abuse, correct?
Associated with sanctioned violence against women and the transgenerational consequences of such in many societies. Yes.
Okay. Will you be doing a book tour with it, or are you just gonna? Is it just going to be released?
Hopefully, when the book comes out, I'll be doing a book tour, and again, hopefully, the book tour will be what is requested by media and bookstores and book reading groups.
Okay, so you guys know now that you need to request this. It's Dr. Rona H. Fields.
M.
I always mess that up. Where did I get H from? Is that Dr. Barry?
I don't know.
Dr. Rona Fields. You can look her up. She's got all these books. Her books, you can get them on Amazon, as well as other areas on the internet. Now, today, though, we're focusing on military, working with military, and about PTSD and what you feel is deserved for our soldiers and for our veterans and their families.
Yes. I think if you want a little history of my experience with it,
yes, please.
It goes back before it was called PTSD. It was called either KZ syndrome, or it was called combat disorder.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something that was minted recently. It's something that has been part of the history of trauma and human beings, all the way back to the people who have become fossils studied by archaeologists and who we know experienced trauma.
So as far back as war and fighting.
War is a big major traumatic experience, but there are also other trauma that are associated with it or derived from it. One of the things that happens when there's a militant society, note I said militant or military society, is that there's an emphasis on the presumed male, the values of a male. And the female becomes a burden to be born. In other words, if strength and fighting are necessary for survival of the group wants to breed males. So how do they breed males? By using females as breeders. And the females who give birth to male children are valued, and those who do not are devalued, and often deliberately.
A lot like what we see over in Afghanistan, like when I was there.
Exactly. Afghanistan is one of the societies about which I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
This is also true in ancient times of all of the societies in Eurasia and Asia, and it's still true of all of the societies in Africa as well.
Okay. Which leads to the other forms of PTSD.
Which goes to rape, all of these things are much more common in a military society. Unfortunately, we see it in the military in the United States today in the form of rape being much more common amongst women in the U.S. military than it is amongst women in ordinary citizen life. This is one of the things that was always used as an argument against allowing women into the military, and then against allowing them full combat role in the military. And I did a study some time ago using the United Nations interim forces in Lebanon as my study sample. And these came from many different countries. And those that included women, I was particularly interested in what the women's experience was. And one of the things I learned was that in the Scandinavian military, as well as in the Irish military, which were the groups that had women in their battalions in Lebanon at the time, all the way up through 1990 is when I did the study, between 1983 and 1990. So one of the things I learned was that, first of all, the Norwegians had whole companies of women. For example, the unit that handled the mechanical work and dealing with machinery like armored vehicles and so on, it's all women.
I did not know that.
It was remarkable that way, and they just kind of took it for granted that if there's a problem,
women will handle it.
They'll handle it. And I interviewed them extensively, and they said there was no issue with their competence, and they were not confronted with sexual demands, and of course they were a unit. And that was how it was handled there. Now, the Norwegian UNIFIL soldiers who went off duty would go down to Israel, as they all did, and there were brothels and places of prostitution that they all knew about.
Yeah.
And they often came back with various sexually transmitted diseases, but that was that
happens
their
even
problem.
now. I can, but we won't go there. But going back to PTSD.
Now, one of the things I found out about PTSD in my studies of peacekeeping soldiers was that they also suffered post-traumatic stress disorder when there were attacks or assaults and they were not supposed to shoot back. They had to hold their fire. And there was a tremendous stress on them because they were trained to shoot. They were trained to pick a target. And they had all of the information, but they couldn't act as they were trained to do. And that was a very interesting kind of post-traumatic stress. So one of the things I learned, because I also spent time then with the Swedish medical team, the medical battalion, and studying some of the statistics and data of the medical system, and also with the Irish who had their own medical people present, their own medical statistics, was that after these incidents, each national group had a different way of manifesting their trauma. The French got all kinds of gastric disorders.
Mm-hmm.
The Nepalese broke bones. They had accidents that broke their bones. The Irish tended to, even though they weren't supposed to, they'd drink on duty, get into automobile accidents, and fights.
How did the Norwegians, the peacekeeping soldiers handle what was their
They
pattern?
were stressed.
What was their pattern? Like you said, the others had broken bones, fighting, drunkenness.
Yeah.
What about the peacekeeping?
They were all peacekeeping forces.
Oh, all of them. These are all the peacekeeping
Yes.
forces. Okay.
And each kind had a different way of experiencing their post-traumatic stress. And one of the things that the Norwegians did that was very interesting was that they had a special institute that studied post-traumatic stress. Actually, that was developed after some of the studies that I had done with Professor Leo Eitinger and Piers Sundby and some of the others in Norway during my fellowship there in 1974, 75. This all evolved. And then it was put to work in the UNIFIL and the peacekeeping operations. One of the things that the Norwegians did was develop an excellent pre-deployment program for their peacekeeping troops on dealing with trauma and stress. Mm-hmm. They also did extensive testing of the people they were sending, and this was followed through by the Swedes as well, and at one point by the Dutch, who also had earlier on a battalion deployed. It was available to anybody in the United Nations who wanted to have any kind of peacekeeping preparation.
So it was open to the United States?
I tried to sell it to the U.S. back in, when did Clinton come into office? It was in 1990. It was around 1991. And at that time we had, very briefly, a Secretary for Defense who was very keen on preparation for peacekeeping. Unfortunately, he had a very brief term, and he was not able to get very far with this. I had actually brought over to the Pentagon and met with some of the military psychologists there a proposal for turning one of the bases that was a relatively unused base in New Jersey at the time that was going to be closed down. And I suggested that that be used instead as a training place. They've since done some preparatory training work, but not on the scale that I was looking at. I wanted that to be a place through which different units would circulate and
as
get
part of their
training.
mobility process.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd get their training.
Now, the things you were saying were really hitting a bell for me. Be a part of going over to Afghanistan, we're to win the hearts and minds of the people. It's not to shoot them up and when it was to win the hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I'm hearing what you're saying from the Peacekeeping Corps, I would like to know your thoughts on the correlation between them, or the comparison between them and U.S. forces in somewhat the similar general orders, so to speak.
Well, you see, one of the things that I would have loved to do as a research project, and I proposed actually to the people at the Uniformed Services University,
Mm-hmm. Also known as USIS.
was, was Dr. Urbino, who was head of the psychology section at the time. In fact, I had with the division, the APA division on the military, Division of Public Service, I think, a joint symposium at APA somewhere in the early 1990s, because joint was with the peace division, the APA division on peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I pulled together for that symposium also, besides this guy from the Uniformed Services University, a Swedish military doctor who was very involved in this and in treating peacekeepers, and a couple of other psychologists from abroad who were involved in this kind of thing. And I thought this would be heavily attended, and it was, but it wasn't chosen as one to be recorded.
Of course not.
And much to my chagrin, and much to my dismay, the Uniformed Services University didn't at that point institute a program.
Mm-hmm.
It was much later before they did. And in fact, I was looked at askance as somebody who wanted to change the military. But they had already studied brainwashing, and instead of applying some of what was learned in many, many studies of Americans and others who'd been put through brainwashing, what they did was to translate that into interrogation techniques. Now, there was a lot learned in that about resilience and about traumatic stress disorder. And unfortunately, that didn't get picked up. I've had it in some of my work since. But this really has to do with training, and only now are they beginning to train people for resilience. And one of the things that blew my mind when they started doing that was that one of the ways they were training them was putting them through brainwashing. That does not create resilience. I had also studied it in the Israeli Defense Forces. And the whole idea that you build resilience by putting people through the experience, letting them suffer, is full of, pardon my expression, crap. Because what it does is, instead, it makes people more susceptible. Once they've suffered from the trauma, that is what stays with them.
For years and years to come, for some of them.
Yes, yes. That is not good training.
No. What would you recommend now?
What I would recommend for training resilience is developing a very positive, strong sense of self. Many of the ways we do it through some of the treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, which you know very well, these can build resilience. They're not only treatment, they're resilience building. And one of the ways that the Norwegians and the Swedes did it was to build the confidence and competence of those they deployed for peacekeeping. The Canadians did a good job of that as well, but they used the training programs in Sweden and Norway. I don't know if they've now developed their own, but I had suggested that we join with them in developing it. There were instances in the peacekeeping, again, where Americans who were with UNSO, which was the Truce Supervision Group, a particular American colonel, was captured and tortured to death. And I felt that the Americans were particularly weak on training to deal with it, and I tried my darndest to ask, beg, implore the people at the Pentagon to work with the Israelis to find him before he was killed. And they refused to do that, because the Israelis knew the area very well and had a record for rescuing people who were captured. But our officials in the military didn't want to work with them.
Well, that's interesting, because I'm actually going to be having the Israelis on here, on this show, in a few weeks. So I'll have to get their take on that one from that perspective.
Well, one of the things that the Israelis did for a long time that I felt was very, very good, and I think they're not doing it as much now, or as well now, because I was just there in 2011 summer. And because I have a grandson who's in the IDF, I kind of got on to what the training programs are. And also some friends who are retired now, psychologists, formerly with the IDF. What they used to do is they had very careful records, psychological test records, on everybody who, when they were called up to service or volunteered or drafted, at the beginning, they kept their school records as well and their medical records. After any incident, any shooting incident, they would immediately review the person psychologically. Now, sometimes they found no impact, and sometimes they found particular kinds of impact. When they found some kinds of impact, that was a basis for putting them through some resilience and treatment. Nothing that would be looked at as, oh, he's crazy.
Yeah, nothing negatively connotated.
It was just routine. They did that.
The military can use for that.
And I think that for many, many years, that kept the IDF very strong, and the people who served in it very centered. Part of it was they knew that they were going to get help for what ailed them, and they weren't afraid to ask for it. There's been a turnaround now. And one of the things that bothered me very much was that instead of the U.S. Army becoming more influenced by the IDF's program, it's been the reverse. And soldiers now are afraid to talk about or report their trauma and their suffering.
I actually got to
anxiety.
See a reason behind that. When coming back from Afghanistan, we had an individual who reported it, and it got spread throughout the entire unit, and that soldier ended up being ostracized because of that. So that stigma is not just in the mind, it is very much real for the U.S. soldiers, so I understand where that's coming from.
Well, and as a result, I feel that there are a lot of Israeli veterans of violence and trauma who are keeping it to themselves and who are potential time bombs. And I don't mind saying it directly to them. What's taken the place of this kind of preparation has been a lot of propaganda, negative propaganda about the enemy. And what happens when a soldier is given this kind of propaganda, that they are beasts, they are not civilized, they are
barbaric,
cruel, they are savages, it enhances their fear of the enemy, and it's expressed in hatred. And they don't see the enemy as human beings, they see them as super Frankensteins. And the last thing that you want to have in a situation where peacekeeping or peacemaking is the objective is this kind of vision of, in quotes, the enemy. So I think that this kind of reversal does the opposite of providing resilience. In order to have resilience, you really need to know that you're facing another human being. He's got his strengths and his weaknesses, and you have to feel that you're building on your strengths, and that you're competent and confident. Not because the other is a wild beast that you have to attack wherever you see anybody who looks like that, but because you know it's another human being and you are confident in your skills.
They know their self-worth.
Yes, exactly. Which is the opposite of what soldiers get if they admit to having been scared. Damn it, you're going to be scared because you're a human being.
It's normal.
It is
it's expected.
Quite normal. And what's not normal is to keep it in your dreams and nightmares.
That compartmentalization that comes out when they're relaxed.
And to have flashbacks. Because that is when you become dangerous. Not to the enemy, but to your own people. So, I mean, I have a lot of issues with the kinds of training that need to be done.
Yes.
I'm not in a position to prescribe this to anybody.
We may have to do another radio show on that one later.
But I do have to tell you that I volunteered a long time ago, and I applied. Actually, I applied to teach at the Uniformed Services University, and I was rejected. I had applied back in 1967 to work with the returning veterans from Vietnam, because I knew what was needed, and I was turned down because I hadn't had a VA internship. And
which, by the way, does still affect individuals.
No, the first time I was turned down because I wasn't a man who had served. Okay? And the second time I was turned down a couple of years later, when I had some notoriety as a psychologist, was because I hadn't had a VA internship. I got my degree before there were VA internships, okay? Yeah. And then I was turned down, after 9/11, because I wanted to do some work at Walter Reed on walking distance from Walter Reed, and everybody was getting shipped there. And I was turned down again because I hadn't any VA experience.
It's basically a catch-22. It doesn't matter what you've done. It's always been one after another.
It doesn't matter. So I'm somebody to whom they refer people that need ongoing treatment sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Now, you volunteer with Give an Hour, correct?
Yes, I volunteered with Give an Hour.
And just out of curiosity, because we've discussed this before, I really want to bring this up. Now, folks, what I'm doing, there's a reason I'm going here, because Dr. Fields has decades of experience in trauma, as you've been hearing, from multiple different areas, not just the United States. We're talking a very worldwide cultural perspective on trauma. How many individuals has been sent to you from Give an Hour?
I have not been sent a single individual by Give an Hour. Instead, they passed my name on to Magellan, which is the contractor with the VA for doing post-traumatic stress cases, and TBI cases. And Magellan pays $40 an hour to clinical psychologists. And I don't know how many clinical psychologists they've had sign up, but when I saw that, I considered it an insult. And beside which I was going to be called a counselor. I am not a counselor. I am a clinical psychologist. And it made me wonder what kind of treatment and service military personnel are going to get as from contractors who have no particular experience in clinical psychology.
Especially when they're turning down individuals who have the experience. Case in point, you're sitting right here in front of me.
So I refused. I said I'd rather give an hour for free than to work for $40 an hour and be called a counselor.
Yeah.
I've been a fellow of the American Psychological Association in several divisions for so many years, and my experience and knowledge is respected
worldwide
as a psychologist. And it's too late in my life to go back to being a counselor. My licensure and my insurance, my liability insurance as a psychologist requires that I used the best practices of a psychologist and the most that I know.
You're ethically bound to do that.
Yes. I can't do it under those circumstances.
So, going back to Magellan, because that's really, I really wanted to hear about how Magellan is working the system to put, pardon this, I'm going to be, this is my personal opinion, less than fully trained and experienced, not just trained, but and experienced, because it's the experience that actually makes the difference. A person can go take a course. It's not until they get experience that they really can truly assist somebody through something. Yeah. So, explain about Magellan.
I've gone...
and TRICARE.
I've been a provider for TRICARE for many years. The pay in TRICARE isn't great, but I'm a psychologist. and I am referred cases, and there's a certain respect that goes with it to my knowledge.